Dr. Arikana Chihumbori Kwao is a name that resonates across Africa and the diaspora, a former African Union ambassador to the United States, an unapologetic Pan-Africanist, and a bold voice for Africa's true independence. She has never held back when it comes to defending Africa's sovereignty and empowering its youth, and now, her voice carries a special message, one directed at the youngest serving president on the African continent, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Born in 1988, President Traoré rose to leadership during a time of political turmoil, military unrest, and deep-rooted foreign influence in his country. At just 34 years old, he took charge of a nation plagued by insecurity, terrorism, and decades of economic dependency. And yet, his leadership is sparking a new conversation, one that centers on African dignity, sovereignty, and unity. In this moment of historic transition, Dr. Chihumbori steps forward not just with praise, but with firm, passionate advice for the young president, advice that's rooted in history, truth, and a vision for a truly liberated Africa. With the fire in her voice that we've come to know and admire, she begins, young man, you are not just the president of Burkina Faso, you are now a symbol of hope for a continent that has long been crippled by external control. The chains of colonialism may have been removed, but the systems of neo-colonialism remain deeply rooted. And it is your task, your divine assignment, to lead your people out of this bondage. Dr. Chihumbori reminds Traoré that the struggle of Burkina Faso is not isolated. The puppeteering of African politics by foreign governments, the looting of natural resources, and the deliberate weakening of African institutions are realities that every African leader must confront. Do not be deceived by temporary applause or diplomatic flattery, she warns, because the same hands that clap for you today may sharpen daggers tomorrow if you threaten their grip on Africa's wealth. She urges Traoré to stay grounded, to remain connected to the people of Burkina Faso, not from the comfort of air-conditioned offices, but through the dust and sweat of the everyday citizen. She insists that the true test of leadership lies not in speeches, but in sacrifice. Let your legacy be that you built schools instead of seeking validation from former colonizers, that you empowered your youth instead of begging for aid, that you stood for truth even when the price was isolation. Dr. Chihumbori's advice doesn't stop at ideology. She offers practical steps. She advises Traoré to invest in Pan-African alliances to build relationships with other leaders on the continent who are aligned in the struggle for independence, especially economic independence. Do not walk this path alone. Reach out to those who are ready to decolonize their minds, work with fellow nations who are ready to reclaim their minerals, their agriculture, their industries. Together, you are stronger. She also calls on him to look inward to revive the spirit of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former leader of Burkina Faso, who once stood boldly against imperialism. She reminds him that Sankara's vision wasn't one of Hatit, was one of self-reliance, pride, and unity. President Traoré Sankara did not die. He lives in your heartbeat, in your mission. But where Sankara left off, you must continue. Not with bullets, but with books. Not with anger, but with action. She cautions him to guard against corruption not just among his opponents, but within his own ranks, because the downfall of many revolutions came not from external enemies, but from betrayal within. Surround yourself with those who love the nation more than they love power. Appoint leaders who serve, not rulers who steal. Burkina Faso does not need kings, and needs servants with a warrior spirit. In the same breath, she praises his courage, his willingness to stand tall even when sanctions, threats, and isolation loomed. She reminds him that Africa's liberation will not be handed over willingly. It must be demanded with wisdom and defended with unity. You will be attacked. You will be labeled. But know this: history will remember those who stood for their people when it mattered most. Dr. Chihumbori calls upon the youth of Africa to rally behind President Traoré, not in blind loyalty, but in shared purpose. She says this is not just his fight, it is theirs too. From the students in Ouagadougou to the young entrepreneurs in Nairobi, to the farmers in Bamako, this moment belongs to all of Africa. If Africa is to rise, then Africa must rise together, she says. As her voice reaches a crescendo, her message becomes not just advice, but a battle cry. The time for begging is over. The time for pretending is over. The time for African excellence is now. And Ibrahim Traoré, you are not just a President, you are a spark. Do not let that fire die. With that, she ends not with applause but with a challenge to President Traoré, a challenge to the youth of Africa, a challenge to history. Dr. Chihumbori's words are more than advice. They are a manifesto, a call to arms, not of war, but of wisdom, unity, and revolution through knowledge. And as the continent watches, one truth becomes clear. Africa is not waiting for saviors. Africa is becoming its own. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with expectation. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and eyes from across the globe were fixed on a single man. Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest president in Africa and one of the most fearless voices to rise from the continent in recent years. He was attending an international summit in Europe, surrounded by world leaders, diplomats, and journalists from powerful Western media outlets. The topic: security, governance, and foreign aid in Africa. But little did the audience know, Traoré had come with a different agenda, one that would shake the very foundations of the discussion. As the moderator welcomed him to speak, murmurs filled the room. Some expected a scripted speech. Others expected careful diplomacy. But what they received was a masterclass in courage, truth, and unapologetic African pride. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, composed and firm. And then, with calm intensity, he began. I did not come here to ask for help. I came here to speak the truth, a truth that has been buried under decades of manipulation, false promises, and exploitation. The room went silent. You say Africa is poor, you say we are unstable, but you do not say why. You do not say who benefits from our poverty, who profits from our instability. Gasps, whispers a few uncomfortable glances. But he continued. We have gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, and yet, our people struggle to eat. Our children study under trees. Our hospitals lack medicine. Why? He turned his gaze directly toward the Western journalists seated in the front row. You speak of aid, as if we are beggars. But let me ask you, how can those who robbed us now pretend to be our saviors? A journalist raised their hand. Mr. President, she asked, what do you mean by robbery? Traoré looked her in the eyes and replied, when French companies earn billions from our uranium, while our people live in the dark, what do you call that? When African presidents are pressured to sign contracts they do not understand, what do you call that? When your governments support coups that install leaders loyal to foreign interests, what do you call that? There was no response, just silence. That is not aid, he said. That is theft dressed in suits and handshakes. The room shifted, some leaned forward, others looked away. But Traoré was just getting started. We will no longer trade sovereignty for loans. We will no longer accept lectures from those who destabilized us. We will no longer apologize for choosing our own path. He paused, then added, Africa is not a child. Africa is not a playground. Africa is a continent of civilizations, wisdom, and resilience. And we are awake now. Applause broke out not from the diplomats, but from a few African representatives sitting at the back, visibly emotional, nodding in solidarity. Traoré ended his speech not with platitudes, but with a challenge. To the world, we say, we want partnerships, not puppeteers. Respect, not pity. And to the African youth, this is your time. Rise, learn, build, and never again allow others to define your worth. As he stepped away from the podium, the journalists were left stunned. There were no further questions, only the echoes of a speech that would be played, replayed, and quoted across Africa for months to come. In a world of polished diplomacy and hollow promises, Ibrahim Traoré had done something rare. He had spoken the raw, uncomfortable truth, and in doing so, he reminded everyone that a new Africa is emerging, not just proud, but powerful, and unafraid to speak. The setting was monumental. For the first time in decades, young African leaders, students, and activists gathered in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, for what would become a defining moment in the modern Pan-African movement. The Pan-African Youth Conference, hosted under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré. The world media barely covered it. But inside Africa, the buzz was unstoppable. Social media trended with hashtags like #AfricaUnites and #NewGenerationOfAfrica. What made this event different wasn't just the number of attendees, it was the clarity of purpose. And at the heart of it all stood Traoré, not behind bulletproof glass, not in the safety of government offices, but right among the youth, not with a military parade, but with the fire of ideas and the strength of unity. As he stepped onto the stage, flanked not by generals but by young innovators, university leaders, and startup founders, the atmosphere felt less like a political event and more like a revolution of thought. His voice echoed through the auditorium. Greater than Africa's borders were drawn by colonizers, but today, we redraw them in our minds, not to divide, but to connect, not with maps, but with vision, collaboration, and courage. He pointed toward the crowd. Greater than, you are not just the future, you are the present. You are not too young to lead. You are too important to wait. The audience erupted. This was more than a motivational speech. It was a declaration. Traoré outlined a youth-centered strategy for African development starting from education, but he wasn't talking about imported curricula or outdated models. He challenged African nations to build a new education system, one rooted in African history, science, and entrepreneurship. Greater than, why do we know more about French kings than our own heroes? Why do we import books from those who erased our culture? He announced a new scholarship fund for students across the Sahel region. funded not by foreign aid, but by national revenue redirected from military contracts and corrupt bureaucracies. He also unveiled a tech innovation hub in Ouagadougou. Pan-Africa would partner with young engineers and developers from Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and Senegal. Greater than the next Google, the next Tesla, the next NASA, must be born on African soil, and we will build it not with loans, but with brilliance and belief. Then came a bold move. Traore signed a symbolic memorandum of unity with attending youth representatives from 17 African countries, including Mali, Guinea, Niger, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Egypt, pledging regional collaboration on youth development projects, cross-border student exchange programs, and Pan-African tech platforms. Greater than we are no longer competing, we are collaborating. If one rises, we all rise. He addressed African youth in the diaspora, urging them to reconnect with their roots, not to escape the West, but to empower the continent. Greater than come with your skills, your dreams, your ambition. Come, build hospitals, write code, teach children, and restore the dignity that was stolen from our ancestors. Throughout the event, music, poetry, and spoken word performances from across the continent reminded everyone that Pan-Africanism is not just policy, it's art, it's culture, it's soul. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, something changed. The energy in the air was different. This wasn't just a conference, it was a seed planted deep in the soil of Africa's rebirth. A young woman from Uganda took the mic during open floor discussion and said, greater than, for the first time, I feel like I belong. For the first time, I believe we can win. Ibrahim Traoré smiled and replied, greater than you already have. The moment you believed it, Africa won. And with that, he walked off the stage not as a commander but as one of the people, a leader by example. That day, the message was clear. Africa's liberation is no longer an event, it is a generation, and the world. It better pay attention. In a private yet pivotal high-level meeting hosted in Addis Ababa under the African Union, key African leaders gathered behind closed doors to meet with representatives from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The purpose? To discuss a special financial support program targeted at post-coup nations and struggling economies across the Sahel. As expected, the IMF arrived with glossy brochures, figures promising billions in loans, and finely tuned diplomatic language about stabilization, partnership, and support. For many leaders in the room, the deal seemed tempting, an easy way to secure short-term economic relief. But when it came time for Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré to speak, what followed shocked the entire room and later, the world. He stood slowly, adjusted his microphone, and then held up the printed IMF proposal. Greater than this document, he said, is not a solution, it is a trap. Gasps echoed. Some leaders looked around nervously. IMF representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Greater than, we have seen this script before. Promises of billions. But at what cost? At the cost of our land, our sovereignty, our children's future. He flipped through the proposal aloud. Greater than structural adjustments, privatization of national assets, deregulation, reduction of state subsidies. He paused. Greater than this is not aid. This is economic warfare camouflaged in spreadsheets. A few delegates from other nations nodded silently. Others avoided eye contact, but Traoré did not stop. Tell me, IMF, how many African countries have taken your loans for decades and yet remain poor? How many governments have bowed to your terms only to find their people deeper in poverty and foreign corporations richer than ever? He dropped the document onto the table with a thud. Greater than, we do not need more debt, we need dignity. The IMF official interrupted, trying to defend the conditions of the proposal. But Traoré cut through the polished words with piercing clarity. Greater than, no nation has ever developed by begging. Look at Asia, look at Latin America. They rose by rejecting the same poison you now offer us. He turned to his fellow African leaders. Greater than, we are 54 countries, with trillions in natural resources, with the youngest population on Earth, with the most sunlight, the richest soil, the deepest mines. Why are we still negotiating with institutions that enslaved our economies since independence? There was silence, and then he said something that would later go viral across African media. Greater than, until we say no together, they will continue to treat us like children in our own house. I refuse. Burkina Faso refuses. Traoré walked out of the room. No further words, no handshakes, just silence behind him and a stunned continent watching. Later that night, as journalists asked him whether his stance might isolate Burkina Faso internationally, he calmly replied, I'd rather be isolated in truth than embraced in submission. Our ancestors were not colonized by force alone, it was through deception. We will not be deceived again. Within hours, his speech circulated across African platforms like wildfire. The youth praised his courage. Economists debated his defiance, but one thing was clear. A line had been drawn, and it wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't just reject a loan, he rejected a legacy of dependence. And in doing so, he reignited a conversation that Africa's elite had long avoided. It was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting, a closed-door discussion between Burkina Faso's leadership and French officials, aimed at restoring ties and rebuilding trust after months of rising tensions. But Ibrahim Traoré had no intention of following the usual diplomatic script. Held in the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, the French ambassador, along with a small delegation, arrived dressed in smiles and polite gestures. They came bearing carefully crafted language about cooperation, counter-terrorism support, and shared history. But President Traore, yet intense, opened the meeting with a sharp and direct tone. Greater than before we begin. Speak plainly. Burkina Faso is not your colony. Not anymore. Not ever again. The room froze. The ambassador, startled, attempted to pivot. Greater than Mr. President. We understand your concerns. France is here in the spirit of partnership. We believe in Traore interrupted. How partnership? He said. Then why do French military bases remain on our land without our full consent? Why do your companies still control our gold mines while our people suffer in poverty? Why do your media outlets continuously insult our sovereignty under the banner of freedom of press? He leaned forward, voice unwavering. Greater than you do not want a partner. You want a puppet. But we are cutting the strings starting today. The ambassador tried to reference the long-standing ties between France and West Africa. Greater than we share a long history, Mr. President. Surely, we can build on that foundation. Traoré's response was swift. Greater than yes, we share a long history, one of exploitation, blood, and betrayal. You speak of history as if it were friendship, but we remember the truth. We remember the looting, the assassinations of our revolutionaries, the manipulation of our governments. Greater than we remember, Thomas sang. Those words hit like thunder, and then came the moment no one expected. Traoré stood, pulled out a sealed folder, and placed it in front of the ambassador. Inside, an official notice ordering the complete withdrawal of all remaining French military personnel and intelligence operatives from Burkina Faso within 30 days. Greater than we no longer need foreign boots on our soil pretending to protect us while undermining us. We will defend ourselves, we will train our own, we will rebuild from within. The French officials were stunned. One began to object, citing international agreements and defense protocols.